friends, it's Christy back with you on the My Favorite Things YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using the new set by Yuzu called Honey Bunny. So I've stamped the images I'll be using on some Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Extreme Black Hybrid ink, and I'll be coloring with my Copic markers. So I'm starting with this large heart-shaped balloon, and I wanted that to be like a nice deep coral, almost like a red. So I'm going to use R11, R20, R22, and R24. So I'm starting with that R24 and laying in some shadows along the edges. I'm staying just a little bit away from the black line so that I can give myself a little bit of like a rim light on the outside edge, so it will show that light is kind of bouncing off this heart-shaped balloon. So once I have that R24 laid in, I'm going to start blending that out on the inside with the R22, just following the shape of that heart. And then I'll come in with R20 next and pull that color even more toward the center. So I'm just working my way around, making sure to grab the edge of that R22 and pull it toward the center with the R20 so that I get a nice smooth blend. And then I'm also going to fill in that outer edge between the R24 and that outer black line. Then I'm going to use R11 to fill in the very center of that balloon where it would be the most puffed out and therefore have the biggest highlight. My R11 is running a bit dry, so I will be doing a second layer to smooth out that blend. And then I came in with my 0 marker, the colorless blender, and just cleaned up any marker that had gone outside the edges so that I can move on to my little bunny. For my bunny, I'm going to use some cool grays using C0, C1, and C3. And again, I'm starting with that darkest shade, the C3, and laying in my shadows on the outer part of his head and his ears, adding a little shadow up under the edge of his shirt and where his cuff is kind of overlapping his arm. And then I'm going to blend that out with the C1. And again, I'm sticking really close to the outside edges because I want him to stay pretty nice and soft. So the darkest 2 shades are just on the outer edges, and then the majority of him will be that C0. So I'm going to bring in that shade on his face, and I wanted to do a little detail around his eyes, kind of leaving some white space in almost like a heart shape where it kind of comes to a point above his nose. And then I'm going to fill in the rest of him with that C0 as well. And I did do a second layer on him, and then I'm going to add a few little dots to his tail with C3. Then I'm going to go back to my R20s. This time I'm going to keep the R11 and R20, but add in the R000. And I'll color in his nose and the insides of his ears and give him some rosy cheeks as well. So I just started with the R20, blended out with the R11, and then used that R000 to soften the edges. And then I'm going to keep these shades and add a little pink breast to each of the birds, but to just make them look a little bit different, I'm going to skip the R20 on those and just start in with that R11. I did 2 layers of that R11 down at the lowest part of their belly, and then just blend it up with the R000 so that it kind of gets softer toward their faces. And I will give them some rosy cheeks as well, just so they look really nice and cheerful. It's just an extra step that I love to do on my critters. So then I'm going to move on to some purple shades, and I'm using V20, V22, V25, and V28 for the bunny's t-shirt. Starting with that V28 and adding some shadows down his back and then a little bit where his leg is kind of overlapping the bottom hem of his shirt and on the bottom part of his sleeve as well. and then blending forward with the V25, the V22, and then just adding a little sliver of highlight with the V20. I'll also take those lightest two shades, the V22 and V20, and add a little bit of detail to the curve of my clouds, not going the whole way across, but just adding a little bit of emphasis here and there along those curves. And then, like I said, I'm blending it out with that lightest shade and letting that fade into white just so they have a little bit of that purple haze to them, which is going to match my sky later on. The birds I also wanted to do in purple just for something different, but I wanted to warm them up a bit, just make them look a little bit different than the other purple tones. So I switched to V000, V01, and V12. So I'm adding a little color with that V12 first, and then blending that out with the V01. And I'll add a little bit of that V000 for a highlight on their faces and the edges of their wings. I'll use YR01 to fill in their beaks. And then I'm going to grab my black Sakura Jelly Roll pen and get that started off to the side so it's flowing nicely. And I'll go over the eyes of my bunny and the two birds that have their eyes open to make them nice and bright and shiny. And then I'll trim these images out with their matching dies. For the background, I'm going to take a piece of Bristol Smooth Surface cardstock and use the cloud stencil to blend on some Distress Oxide ink, starting with Shaded Lilac at the top. So I'm just starting on that stencil and using very, very light pressure to get just the palest little bit of clouds at the top. I want to do kind of like an ombre look where it's very light at the top and then darker as I go toward the bottom. So as I go on this second cloud formation, I'm getting a little bit more heavy-handed with my ink. And I'll just continue turning that stencil so that I get a new design each time. On this third row, I'm starting with the Shaded Lilac, but then I'm going to introduce some Dusty Concord. And first I just used the ink blending tool and whatever was left on that. But I did decide to add in a little bit of ink. Just a little bit goes a long way with the Dusty Concord because it is quite dark. And then I blended that out with more of the Shaded Lilac. And then this time on the fourth row, I am starting in with just the Dusty Concord. And I made sure the application of that ink was a little bit thicker, and then I'm blending out again with the Shaded Lilac. So always kind of incorporating a little bit of that Shaded Lilac to kind of soften the top edge of the cloud. And then for this last one, I'll come in with more Dusty Concord, and this time I'm being a lot more heavy-handed, so you can see it gets quite a bit darker. And then I'm going to blend some extra ink down at the bottom so we get that nice soft glow there as well, and it's not just that stark white cardstock. And then once again blending out with the Shaded Lilac. So once I am happy with how that is looking, I'm going to add some distressing to this. I'm going to start with some clean clear water, squirting that onto an acrylic block, and then tapping it off with a thin paintbrush. So that water will react with those Distress Oxide inks and kind of lift the color in those areas. And tapping off that acrylic block just gives me a little bit more control so I get a finer spray of dots. And then I'm going to press some of both of those shades of ink onto the block as well and add some water to those so I can do some splatter detail with that and just give it a bit more movement, a bit more life to this background. So I'm starting with the Shaded Lilac first and then going in with the Dusty Concord as well. Again, tapping off to get that fine spray so I can control how much of that I want. And then I'll set this panel aside to dry. Once it has, I'm going to trim this down with the Wonky Stitch Rectangle Stacks. I'm using the largest one so I get that nice stitching detail that's interwoven on the edges. And then I'm going to work on my sentiment. And I'm just stamping that down on another piece of white cardstock using that Dusty Concord Distress Oxide ink again, just so everything really matches perfectly. And I'm using the sentiment that says, "Hey there, honey bunny." I stamped that down twice to make sure it was nice and bold. And then I'm going to pop my card base in my MISTI. I'm using Grapesicle cardstock. And again, that Dusty Concord Distress Oxide ink. And I chose another little bunny holding the heart and the sentiment, "You make my heart hop." So I stamped that down twice, and then there was just one part of his foot that I hadn't inked up properly, so I added a little extra ink on that. And then I'm ready to start assembling. So I'm going to take the background and glue that down to the card base. And it's going to give me that really gorgeous Grapesicle cardstock, which is like almost a perfect match to this background. I think it's just so stunning together. And then I have trimmed down my sentiment using the Essential Stitched Sentiment strips. So I'm going to pop that up on some foam tape down at the bottom. And then I'm going to add my images. I'm going to take the bunny on the balloon and just stick it there in the center right now as a placeholder. I have not removed the backing sheets from the foam tape yet. I just wanted to use that as a placeholder to get my clouds correct. So I'm kind of spacing them out around him and making sure that the clouds kind of switch back and forth because there's two different styles there. So just putting one on the left and one on the right and then reversing it on the lower part of the scene. And I think adding in those extra clouds really gives the scene dimension because it pushes those clouds in the background back even farther. And then to give it more dimension, I'm gluing these clouds down with just some liquid glue, and then adding the bunny and the rest of the images with foam tape is going to bring them really forward in the scene and give them that focus. I am adding just the tiniest bit of liquid glue to the bottom of the balloon string so that that will lay flat on the card so it won't end up getting bent up as it goes through the mail or anything like that. So then I have my couple of birds. I'm going to stick one sitting on the other end of the heart-shaped balloon to balance out the bunny. Another one I'm going to add down on top of the sentiment. And then there's one that is flying, and I'm going to add this one over on the left-hand side, kind of tipped at an angle to just make him look like he's in flight. Then I'm going to add a few little iridescent hearts here and there on this background. It's just a subtle detail that looks really pretty when you tip the card into the light. So I'm going to add a sprinkle of those all over the background, just kind of adding a tiny bit of glue and then placing them over top using my embellishment wand. And I'll continue doing that until the background is nice and full and you just get those really pretty hearts all over. And if I end up placing them a little bit wonky, I can use the back of that stick to kind of straighten them up before the glue dries. And then of course I had to add my favorite embellishment, Stardust Stickles. It's just such a pretty pop of glitter on a card. So I'm going to add that to the edge of the heart-shaped balloon, kind of just laid down a line of it and then used the nib to swirl it around to kind of soften it. And then I also wanted to add it to the bottom of each of those stamped clouds just to add a little bit of glitter somewhere else in this scene. And that's it. I didn't want to overdo it. So I'm going to lift this card up to the light so you can see all those little flashes of sparkle and shimmer. And of course, I'll give you another peek at the inside. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. I had so much fun creating it for you, and I'm hoping that you're feeling inspired. So if you are, you can leave me a comment down below and let me know. Subscribe to My Favorite Things for more inspiring videos just like these here on screen. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.